Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is always to take deep and really insightful source material, unpack it, and see how that ancient wisdom connects to the questions we're all facing today. And for this deep dive, we are going far away from the modern world, right into the dusty fields of the Old Testament.
That's right.
We're going to explore a dense, but I think incredibly beautiful Bible essay. It's focused on a profound, yet, often overlooked parable in the book of Isaiah.
Yeah, chapter 28, verses 23 through 29. And it is a remarkable passage.
It really is.
And what stands out immediately, I think, is that it challenges our usual assumption about parables.
Right. We think of Jesus automatically.
We do. Most Christians, you hear parables, you go straight to the Gospels. But this source material reminds us that the prophets, long before the Sermon on the Mount, they were just masterful teachers. They used these familiar, everyday scenes from their world, a vineyard, a fishing net, and in this case, the farmer's craft, to communicate God's deep, eternal wisdom to souls that were, frankly, riddled with anxiety.
I think riddled with anxiety is the perfect setup for this. Because our mission today is, it's intensely pastoral. It's practical.
It has to be.
We want to deeply understand how Isaiah uses this very commonplace agricultural metaphor to help thoughtful Christians, both then and now, trust in God's magnificent wisdom, especially when we're walking through seasons of pressure or discipline or just difficulty.
We're looking for peace in the furrow.
Exactly.
But we're really just following the prophet's lead here. Isaiah begins this whole section not with a gentle suggestion, but with this powerful, direct invitation. He's asking the listener to engage their mind and settle their heart.
That's verse 23, right?
That's verse 23. He says, "Listen and hear my voice. Pay attention and hear what I say." This isn't just passive information he's giving.
No.
It's an invitation to active trust. We have to approach this material seeking to understand that when God allows discipline or difficulty, it is never, ever arbitrary pain. It's always linked to a divine, wise purpose.
Okay, so let's unpack that by setting the historical context, because that urgency is what gives this whole parable its sharpest edge.
Yes.
When Isaiah is speaking this, Judah is facing a nightmare. This is not a time of peace and quiet prosperity. Yeah. They are on the very edge of national judgment, maybe even total ruin.
Precisely. They were staring down the most terrifying military machine of their day, which was Assyria. We see this looming threat so clearly in other parts of Isaiah, chapters 28 and 7, where the prophet is just trying to reason with a desperate nation. But the true danger wasn't just external.
It was internal.
It was internal.
So can you elaborate on that? What did that internal decay actually look like? What had hollowed out Judah's strength?
Well, the sources reveal this really tragic cocktail of political folly and spiritual pretense.
Okay.
Politically, they were just scrambling. They were trying to secure alliances, usually with Egypt, which God had specifically warned them against, rather than relying on him.
And spiritually?
Spiritually, they had kept up all the rituals, going to the temple, offering the sacrifices. But their hearts were so far from God, there's deep moral compromise, and the leaders were far more interested in their own schemes than in righteousness.
So what's the result of all that?
Fear. Fear was rampant, and faith had just withered.
So, into the middle of this deep national chaos and fear, Isaiah introduces this image, this farmer's calm. That contrast is just so striking, isn't it? He pulls their gaze away from the swirling dust of Assyrian chariots and points them toward the predictable, purposeful rhythm of a planting cycle.
And that is the narrative genius of the passage. The core assertion we are meant to grasp, the thing we're supposed to hold on to, is that God acts with measured purpose.
Right.
The farmer doesn't panic. He follows an ancient, proven design. And the logic is, if God is directing the smallest, most common task in creation, just tilling a field, then surely he's directing the fate of nations.
So God isn't wasting the pain. He's not confusing severity with just random cruelty.
Never. And the essay states that the farmer's ordinary skill, it actually reflects a much higher heavenly wisdom.
He's borrowing it, in a sense.
He is. God plows, he plants, and he threshes with specific limits and for specific goals. And the entire passage, it all builds to this magnificent conclusion that this purpose-driven work is necessary because, quote, his plan is wonderful and his wisdom is magnificent.
And that's the anchor.
That declaration is the anchor. It tells the listener, settle down. The hand that's guiding this plow is infinitely wise.
Okay, let's ground ourselves in just how familiar this metaphor was for Isaiah's original hearers. They weren't living like we do in an urban society. They lived close to the soil. For them, this farming analogy wasn't some abstract idea. It was their lifeblood. So what was the first key rhythm they would have instantly recognized, starting with the preparation?
Well, the process always starts with plowing, and plowing was the first great act of hope after that long, dry summer. Once the early rains, they were called the Yora, once they arrived, usually in the autumn, they would soften that sun-baked ground, and that was the signal.
Time to start again.
The season is restarting. The farmer would take his plow, often drawn by an ox, and he would begin breaking up the hard clods. It required strength, focus, and a great deal of forward-looking hope. You're trusting in God's faithfulness for the climate.
And crucially, the text emphasizes that this plowing, this breaking up, it has a boundary. It has to stop.
Absolutely vital. Isaiah 28:24 asks this rhetorical question. Does the plowman keep plowing to sow? Does he keep on breaking up and harrowing his soil?
And anyone listening would know the answer.
Anyone who knows the land knows the answer is an emphatic no. Plowing is, by nature, destructive work. Its goal is to create the right conditions, to turn up the soil, expose the roots and stones, aerate the earth.
But if you keep doing it,
If the plowing continues indefinitely, it destroys the very possibility of a harvest. It just turns the land into dust.
so the very nature of agricultural preparation contains this innate promise. The cutting, the breaking. It must conclude when the ground is ready for the seed.
Yes.
And if we carry that over to our spiritual lives, it speaks immediately against that feeling that discipline is just this endless, pointless thing.
It reframes our entire perspective on suffering, doesn't it? If we feel the plow in our lives, the disruption, the exposure, the breaking up of our comfortable routines or our self-reliant attitudes, we can take comfort in knowing that the master farmer has a definite schedule. The purpose is preparation for planting, not perpetual tearing. If the plowing never stopped, nothing good could ever take root, and the whole point of God's redemptive plan is always growth and fruitfulness.
Okay, so once the ground is prepared, the farmer moves into sowing. And the sources stress that this requires serious judgment and variety. It's not a chaotic act.
No, and that variety is the key theological move here. Ancient Near East farming was surprisingly sophisticated. The farmer had to distinguish between the delicate, high-value spice crops and the sturdy, life-sustaining grains.
So give us an example.
Okay, so tiny, fragrant seeds like caraway and cumin, which were difficult to harvest, they commanded a high price. They were sown very gently, maybe hand-scattered or just pressed lightly into the surface.
As opposed to the staple crops.
Exactly. Versus the staple grains, wheat, barley, and spelt. These sturdier seeds were placed deliberately, often in furrows, according to the specific needs of that particular plot of land.
So one field might be better for barley, another for wheat.
Right. One field might be moister, requiring barley. Another might be firmer, perfect for wheat. The farmer didn't treat the robust wheat the same way he treated the delicate cumin. His choices were wise, they were custom-tailored, and they were deliberate.
I imagine the people listening to Isaiah would have recognized that tailored care instantly. They would know that just a uniform application would lead to total failure.
Exactly. And the spiritual implications for Israel were profound because for them, agricultural success was tied directly to covenant life.
The field was a mirror.
The field was literally a reflection of their obedience. The yield, the rain, the freedom from blight or invaders, it all rose or fell based on their trust in God and their obedience to the law.
So if the crops failed, if there was a drought, or if the Assyrian army was at the border, that wasn't just bad luck.
No.
It was viewed through a covenantal, spiritual lens.
It was always viewed as meaningful. Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 explicitly connect national obedience with agricultural blessing and disobedience with curses like drought or enemy occupation. So when Isaiah's audience faced the Assyrian threat, they understood it was not some random geopolitical event. It was a severe spiritual sign. The sources remind us that prophets like Amos clearly showed God using drought to call his people back to himself.
So that farming rhythm was a constant, tangible reminder that their very life depended on aligning with God's established order.
It was, and yet they kept running to political schemes and empty rituals instead of just turning to God.
Their anxiety was driving them.
Their anxiety was leading them astray. But the Lord, through Isaiah, offered a better way, a simpler, profoundly restful way. It's beautifully summarized in Isaiah 30:15. True safety lay in return, rest, quiet trust, and uprightness. And this agricultural metaphor makes that call relatable at such a fundamental level. They understood that hard ground had to be broken up, and their own hearts were the hard ground. When God initiates plowing, their hearts, responding to that familiar muscle memory, are being prepared for the rest that comes from quiet trust.
Okay, so if plowing is preparation and sowing is custom wisdom, the final stage is threshing. This is where the pressure is applied and the separation occurs. It sounds like this phase also requires the farmer's measured hand.
Oh, it requires immense skill and restraint. This is highlighted in Isaiah 28:27. This is the moment where the valuable seed is separated from the useless chaff and stalk. But how you separate the grain depends entirely on the crop. For sturdy grain heads like wheat and barley, you use the most aggressive tools. A heavy sledge, often studded with sharp stones or iron, or a cartwheel pulled over the grain to crush the stalk.
That sounds intense. I mean, it sounds like maximum force is being applied.
It's maximum necessary force. But for the small, delicate, high-value crops, the cumin, the caraway, that kind of force would pulverize the spice. It would ruin the entire crop.
So you need a different tool.
For those, the farmer used a gentle rod or a stick, just tapping enough to release the tiny aromatic seed. The entire goal of the process, even at its most stressful, is release and preservation, not destruction.
So the threshing floor itself becomes this powerful symbol across the entire biblical narrative. It's where separation happens, but it's a separation aimed at revelation, distinguishing the useful from the useless.
Exactly. And if you look across the narrative, the threshing floor is consistently a place where divine purpose is revealed through these really intense circumstances.
Like with David.
Take the story of David, for instance. Jerusalem was under threat because of David's sin in numbering the people. The angel of judgment stood ready to strike. And where did David meet mercy?
On the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite.
Exactly. That is such a key detail that so often gets glossed over. The physical place of potential judgment became the very ground for divine intervention.
It's the ultimate paradox.
It is. David purchased that ground at the Lord's command, establishing a place where judgment was appeased by sacrifice. And that very threshing floor later became the site of Solomon's temple.
The permanent seat of worship.
The permanent seat of worship, peace, and God's dwelling place. The place where the rod of divine correction was revealed became the permanent center of peace and access to God.
That is profoundly resonant. It suggests that the places where we experience the deepest, most necessary separation in our lives can ultimately become the most sacred grounds for our future worship.
And we see it again with Ruth. She, a Gentile widow, finds her redemption, kindness, and inclusion into the covenant line, not in a palace, but at the threshing floor of Boaz. She goes there in the dead of night, vulnerable and hopeful. And it's there, amidst the hard work and separation of the harvest, that Boaz acknowledges his covenant duty, securing her future and her legacy. The threshing floor was where her hidden goodness, her commitment to Naomi, was revealed and secured through the kindness of her Redeemer.
So the insight for us, for you listening, is essential.
Right.
We are so tempted to view seasons of crushing pressure as evidence of God's abandonment or his cruelty.
Right.
But when the Lord's hand is guiding the work, that pressure is purifying, not punitive.
It is the careful hand of the farmer seeking to preserve the grain. What he separates out, the chaff of our pride, the dross of our self-reliance, the roots of bitterness. He does so not to harm us, but to preserve the life, the genuine fruit within us. It assures us that our pain has a magnificent purpose.
With that cultural context established, let's now walk slowly through the actual questions the prophet Isaiah poses, starting with the assurance that this work is not endless. The first question about the plowman, does he keep plowing forever, is such a simple yet powerful way to communicate divine restraint.
It's common sense elevated to theological truth. The obvious answer, no, the plowman has to stop, serves as this gentle but firm rebuke to Judah's crippling fear.
They really thought this was the end.
They genuinely believed that the Assyrian invasion and the exile that would follow meant absolute and final destruction. Their experience felt like an endless tunnel of chastening with no light at the end.
But the Lord is saying, I am the farmer, and I know when the ground is ready.
Precisely. And this provides a massive spiritual comfort. Chastening is not infinite. Discipline is strictly for a season, with a specific, measurable goal established by God's own wisdom. We need to remember that the plow is just a means to an end.
And what is that end exactly? The final harvest?
Well, the immediate end is defined very clearly, to prepare hearts to receive his word. The prophet Hosea speaks directly to this. He urges the people, sow for yourselves righteousness, reap in mercy, break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord.
Break up your fallow ground.
Yes. God's discipline is the means to break the fallow ground, that hard, unworked, resistant soil of the human heart.
Which means that even the tearing down is fundamentally an act of planting.
It is the necessary step before the renewal, The source material points us to Jeremiah, where God commissions the prophet, saying he was set over nations to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant.
You have to see the sequence.
You have to see the sequence. The destructive work, the plowing and breaking must precede the productive, joyful work of building and planting. It's a promise that whatever God tears down in our self-reliance, he plans to plant again in humility.
Which brings us back to that long-term goal.
The harvest of righteousness and peace mentioned in the New Testament in Hebrews 12.
Okay, so moving to the next stage, sowing. The variety we discussed, caraway, cumin, wheat, barley, spelt, is emphasized as a pattern of divine dealing. The farmer knows his field and custom tailors the planting.
And this variety is so crucial because it speaks against any idea of randomness in God's methods. If a farmer just threw all the seeds onto the same plot, you would ruin the crop.
Right.
Wheat needs deep soil and a firm foundation. Cumin needs gentle scattering. So God's dealings with his people are not generic. They are based on his perfect knowledge of the soil, the nature, the character, and the needs of the individual or the nation.
And here's the link that moves this from just a lesson in agriculture to a cornerstone of theology. Isaiah 28, verse 26. Where does the farmer get this sophisticated judgment?
The text provides the stunning answer. His God instructs him and teaches him the right way. The skill of the farmer, the very knowledge of when to plow and how to sow, is actually a reflection of heavenly wisdom. It's a kind of common grace borrowed directly from the Lord of hosts.
Wow.
The farmer is just following an established divine order that's built right into creation.
That is a staggering realization.
Yeah.
I mean, if ordinary skill is borrowed from God, then God's intentionality in our own lives must be infinitely greater.
It has to be. The implications for God's kingdom dealings with Judah are clear. His actions allowing the Assyrian pressure, delaying the deliverance, that wasn't guesswork. It was based on sovereign, calculated judgment. He knew the precise measure of pressure needed to finally break the clods of self-reliance that Judah had cultivated for generations.
The plowing and the sowing, then, they become instruments of God's humble but effective work.
Exactly. He knew precisely where to sow the promises, his word of eventual restoration and peace that would finally take root in a broken, humbled, and contrite people. Psalm 51 talks about God not despising a contrite heart, and Isaiah 57 promises that God dwells with the humble and contrite to revive their spirits. The custom-tailored discipline is aimed at producing that contrition, which is necessary for revival.
It truly reframes difficulty. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? We're invited to ask, what precise seed is the master sower preparing this soil for?
That's the question.
Okay, now for the third movement, threshing with restraint. This is perhaps the most necessary assurance for people who feel, quite literally, crushed by their circumstances. The text repeats the caution about using the gentle rod for caraway and cumin versus the heavy sledge for sturdier grain.
It is the ultimate boundary-setting lesson. The force applied is measured to the strength and delicacy of the material. A delicate spice must never be crushed. And that speaks volumes about God's care for the weakest among his people, those who feel most vulnerable and small. He knows their capacity.
And the second great assurance here is that the work has a definite conclusion.
The most direct reassurance is in verse 28. Grain must be ground to make bread, so one does not go on threshing it forever. The work has a specific purpose, to produce life-giving sustenance, and therefore it has a conclusion. The moment the grain is released and ready, the wheel has to stop.
This would have directly addressed Judah's crushing fear, this view that the coming sieges were the end of their story, just an endless ruin.
Their perspective was, and this is understandable, limited by their pain. But the Lord is saying, I set the boundaries for every rod. He halts the wheel and the work is complete. The sources point us to Isaiah 10, where God explicitly calls Assyria the rod of my anger.
So he's in control of the instrument of judgment.
He makes it clear that Assyria is a tool, and the tool is not sovereign.
So even the most terrible instrument of judgment has a specific, limited mandate from God.
Absolutely. God tells his people in Isaiah 10, do not be afraid of the Assyrians. In a little while, my wrath against you will end, and my anger will be directed to their destruction. The tool of judgment is itself subject to judgment once its specific, measured work is complete. This means the discipline Judah faced was never designed to annihilate them, but to refine them.
And what's the foundational principle that allows God to exercise such restraint, even amidst necessary judgment?
It's the foundation of his character, his covenant loyalty. Behind each measured stroke stands the Lord who keeps his promises, even as he purifies. We are directed back to that profound declaration of God's nature in Exodus 34. He is compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Even when he is punishing the guilty, his love bounds the action, and Lamentations 3 assures us that he does not willingly bring affliction or grief. The discipline, however painful, is always framed by his unwavering commitment to his people's ultimate good.
So the parable doesn't just end with relief, it ends with worship. The grand statement of verse 29, all this also comes from the Lord Almighty, whose plan is wonderful, whose wisdom is magnificent.
And this is the critical transition point where Isaiah demands that we trade panic for praise.
Yeah.
This isn't just stoic endurance, a grim, I must simply get through this.
No.
It's a worshipful, faith-filled response to wise providence. It's acknowledging that even the painful parts of the process are wonderful because they are part of a magnificent plan.
Why are those two terms, wonderful and magnificent, so important here?
Well, wonderful suggests something awe-inspiring, beyond our human comprehension, something that compels admiration. And magnificent suggests scale and scope, the grandeur of his detailed wisdom. The Lord is teaching Judah that the same detailed, custom wisdom he uses to instruct a simple farmer on when to stop plowing and how to use the rod, he applies to the complex, terrifying business of leading an entire nation through discipline into renewal.
So the whole point is that we can trust the farmer's hand because that hand is ultimately the hand of the Lord Almighty.
Exactly. And his direction is always characterized by compassion. Psalm 103 is a perfect companion bulls here. He has compassion on those who fear him, for he knows how we are formed. He remembers that we are dust.
He knows our limits.
He is not a distant, cold taskmaster. He is a shepherd farmer. Therefore, when we finally see the purpose, the limit, and the tailor-made care in the discipline, the only possible response for the human heart is to declare his plan wonderful and his wisdom magnificent.
Okay. This beautiful ancient imagery gives us 4 vital theological insights that apply across the entire sweep of Scripture and God's dealings with humanity. Let's start by firmly establishing that link between difficulty and divine objective.
Yes.
The first insight is that the parable guards us from despair by ensuring we never separate discipline from purpose. If we're afflicted, we need to ask, what is the farmer doing? He is plowing. He is opening the hard soil of the heart.
And the ultimate purpose is for the seed of his word to take root and bear the enduring fruit of character. You can think of the plowing as a necessary form of preparatory grace. The ground of the human heart left to itself, it just becomes stone hard, resistant to true life.
But God promises to change that.
God promises to replace that heart of stone with a heart of flesh when he restores his people. Discipline is the process that prepares the soil for that fundamental heart-level transformation.
This brings us back to the crucial distinction we made earlier. It's correction, not crushing.
Absolutely. The farmer God corrects, but he stops when the work is done. Again, Lamentations 3 is critical assurance. For the Lord will not cast off forever. Though he causes grief, yet he will show compassion according to the multitude of his mercies. He is not arbitrary. He is always measuring his actions against the vastness of his compassion. When we understand difficulty through this lens, we realize it's an act of deep, protective, and refining love.
And the New Testament really formalizes this wisdom in the context of fatherly training.
Yes. Hebrews 12 provides the definitive commentary on the farmer's measured approach. We are told God disciplines us for our good in order that we may share in his holiness. And the passage is so profoundly honest about the immediate experience.
It says it's not pleasant.
It says no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but grievous. Yet the long-term conclusion is guaranteed. It produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. The parable of Isaiah is the agricultural blueprint for this heavenly fatherly training.
Okay, the second theological insight is about reading the entirety of God's redemptive plan through history, what the essay refers to as the dispensational vantage. That term might be a bit technical for some. Let's clarify it simply.
Yeah, we can rephrase this concept as simply acknowledging God's varied and custom-tailored ways in history. It just honors the fact that God has dealt with his people, Israel, and later the church, in distinct ways across different eras of time, but always moving toward one single ultimate redemptive purpose.
And Isaiah's variety in sowing the cumin versus the wheat provides a perfect metaphor for God's variety in application throughout history.
It does. We see this variety so clearly in God's dealings with Israel, without a doubt. He called Abraham and promised a global blessing through him, gave the rigid law at Sinai to define righteousness, and then patiently wooed them through the prophets despite their disobedience. And even when they failed spectacularly, he preserved a remnant. This commitment proves that his promises would not, could not fail.
And if we look forward, the principle of measured pressure applies even to the most intense events described in Scripture.
It does. The source points us to the future tribulation, that period of worldwide distress described by Jeremiah as the time of Jacob's trouble. Scripture describes this severe season as a measured threshing for the nation of Israel, a pressure designed not for annihilation, but to press them toward repentance and corporate faith in their Messiah.
So even that severe season is not pointless pressure. It's measured to an end.
It is entirely purposeful. It is the necessary preparation for the joy of the kingdom, the grand future promised in the Old Testament. This severe season concludes precisely when the nation looks upon the one they pierced and is finally cleansed and restored. The end goal is the fulfillment of prophetic visions, when the knowledge of the Lord fills the earth and true peace streams out from Zion. Even the severest application of the rod is a measured stroke leading to a magnificent conclusion.
This variety leads us directly to the third insight. The need to honor both the distinct, ongoing paths of Israel and the current calling of the church. The parable respects the church's present experience without erasing the future promises made to Israel.
We are reminded in 1 Corinthians 3 that believers today, the church, are God's field and God's building. Our foundation is Christ. The Spirit is active among us, cultivating the soil, sowing the word, and continuously pruning the branches for greater fruitfulness. The Father trains us for holiness. This is our present magnificent reality.
But we have to be careful not to confuse our field with the promises made explicitly to the original field, Israel.
We must maintain that clarity, just as Paul does in Romans 11. We joyfully recognize that God's mercy is so great that all Israel will be saved in his own time. Their gifts and calling as a nation are irrevocable. We hold that promise firm even as we, the church, labor now among the nations, fulfilling the Great Commission and making disciples in this current age.
So the farmer's wisdom applies to both fields, tailored to their specific purpose and their specific season in history.
It's one Lord, the Lord of hosts, who possesses all the wisdom. He knows what to sow in the church now and what to do to prepare Israel for their promised kingdom future. He knows the different crops, the different seasons, the specific cultivation methods required. And the foundation of all of this is that he never, ever forgets a promise he has made.
The final, and I think most compelling theological significance is that the entire agricultural metaphor points ultimately to Christ.
Yes.
He's the place where God's perfect justice and his perfect mercy meet.
And Christ fits multiple roles in this agricultural tapestry. He is the sower, certainly, the one who spreads the word of the kingdom across the field of the world. And he's the Lord of the harvest, who commissions and sends out the laborers into the fields.
But the deepest paradox of the parable, the purpose of the grain being crushed and separated to produce life, is most fully realized in his unique role.
He is the grain itself. Jesus said, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. The crushing of the strongest seed, the perfect grain, is what brings life to the many. His voluntary death and subsequent resurrection are the source of our new life, our entire inheritance, and our living hope.
So if the threshing floor symbolizes separation leading to peace and worship, then the cross is the ultimate threshing floor.
That is the ultimate conclusion. At the cross, the full judgment for humanity's sin, the necessary plowing and threshing, was placed upon the perfect Son. Isaiah 53 speaks of him being wounded for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. God dealt with sin completely there. Through Christ, God turned necessary judgment into salvation for all who believe, opening a new and living way into his presence.
And the doxology in Isaiah 28, where the prophet asserts that wisdom comes from the Lord Almighty, that compels us to look directly to Jesus.
Because Christ is that magnificent wisdom. He's not merely an example of wisdom, he is its embodiment. Paul tells us that Christ has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. The farmer's plan, wonderful and magnificent in its detail, is entirely centered on the person, the perfect life, and the redeeming work of Jesus Christ.
We've established the cultural foundation, the narrative thread, and the theological weight. Now let's make this tangible. How do we take the rhythm of the farmer's life and apply it to our own anxieties and decisions in the 21st century?
Yeah.
The first lesson is about recognizing the phase we are in. When circumstances feel like plowing, difficult, messy, disruptive, exposing, we must learn to trust the timing. Hard soil is not hopeless soil.
No. And the sensation of plowing in modern life.
Yeah.
It might look like the sudden loss of a job, a serious relational conflict that forces a painful confrontation, or a long, deep season of spiritual dryness where prayer just feels like hitting a wall. These are moments where God is turning up the soil.
So what specifically is God exposing or turning up in those moments?
He's exposing the buried stones, maybe deep roots of unacknowledged pride, stubborn dependencies on comfort, or deeply ingrained sinful patterns that we just refuse to acknowledge in easier times. He is doing necessary preparatory work to ready the heart to receive his word with true depth.
Right.
Plowing prevents the word from being scorched by trials or choked by the worries and riches of this life, just as Jesus warned in his parable of the sower.
We see that testimony throughout Scripture, that affliction itself can be a teacher.
It is the consistent confession of the saints. David, speaking of his own experience, said, "Before I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I obey your word." He even said it more strongly, "It was good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees." Affliction, or plowing, produces a tender conscience and steady obedience, which is ultimately for our good.
So when the plowing season feels incredibly long and painful, what is the practical posture we should adopt?
We have to intentionally humble ourselves. We cling to the promises that God will not despise a broken and contrite heart. We submit under the mighty hand of God, remembering that he gives grace only to the humble.
So we trust the process.
The plowing hurts, it's grievous, but it is necessary work setting the stage for planting and ultimately fruitfulness. Trusting the timing means believing that the season must conclude when the soil is ready.
Okay, the second application is crucial, especially in our hyper-connected comparative culture. The farmer does not treat cumin like wheat, and God does not treat every believer exactly the same way. We have to read the variety of God's dealings as wisdom, not randomness or unfairness.
And this is directly challenging the temptation to measure our field against our neighbors. We scroll through social media and we see someone else's field seemingly flourishing without any obvious plowing or threshing, and we feel discontented or even judged by our own season of difficulty.
Right.
This is where we must trust the custom-tailored care.
Can you give some examples of how God custom tailors his care?
Sure. For one believer facing a severe addiction, God might provide an immediate supernatural escape from temptation. For another believer dealing with chronic, debilitating illness, God might grant sufficient sustaining grace for endurance through deep weakness, saying, "My grace is sufficient for you." For a third, God brings a firm, specific correction through a clear crisis. The care is always custom-tailored to the specific strength of the soil and the specific seed he intends to plant.
So the lesson here is twofold: resisting envy and trusting that the Master knows our limits.
Absolutely. We must resist the destructive envy of others' fields and embrace our own appointed plot, trusting that the Master knows this specific soil and this particular seed best. He is so custom-tailored in his approach that he knows how to restore souls who feel like bruised reeds or smoldering wicks broken and nearly extinguished. He strengthens what remains until it shines again. He will not break what is bruised. His hand is always faithful and never applies pressure beyond what his child can bear with his help.
The third lesson brings us to the most painful reality: threshing. The trial is real, but it is not perpetual. We have to let the Lord set the measure of pressure and the limits of the time.
That assurance from Isaiah 28:28 that one does not go on threshing it forever is a lifeline when we feel overwhelmed. God places precise limits on every trial. He never just hands us over to the elements.
He's present in it.
Not only does he set limits, but he promises his immediate protective presence within the fire and the water. We are not enduring this alone.
When we are under pressure, the natural tendency is to focus solely on the weight of the hardship. How does Paul urge us to shift our gaze?
Paul provides that eternal perspective in 2 Corinthians 4. He calls his own immense hardships, the scourges, the imprisonment, the perpetual threats, light and momentary.
Which seems impossible.
They only become light and momentary when they are compared with the eternal, overwhelming, immeasurably more weight of glory that God is preparing for us. When we fix our gaze on the unseen, eternal reality of the harvest, we gain the strength to endure the seen, temporary hardship of the threshing floor.
And what does that kind of endurance look like in action?
It means we certainly pray for deliverance and we ask for wisdom in the midst of the trial, but ultimately we keep doing good work. We keep our hands to the plow, committing our way to the Lord, confident that we will reap a harvest of peace and righteousness if we do not grow weary and give up. The threshing is not our final destination. It's a vital step on the path to the guaranteed harvest.
The final lesson brings us back to the gentle, personal relationship with the Lord, even in moments of discipline. We have to watch for Christ's gentle hand, which is always present.
He is the Good Shepherd. We often visualize the beautiful comfort of Psalm 23, making us lie down in green pastures and restoring our souls.
Yes.
But we must never forget that the same shepherd leads us through the darkest valley, the valley of the shadow of death. The shepherd does not abandon his sheep at the threshold of the trial. He walks with us through it.
And the very tools he carries in that valley, his rod and his staff, are both explicitly called instruments of comfort.
And that is the profound truth of the shepherd's tools. The staff guides, protects, and pulls us back from danger when we wander. The rod corrects, disciplines, and defends us from external threats. They are distinct actions, but they're both tools of comfort because they signal his sovereign presence and purposeful care. We feel the correction and know we are not abandoned or forgotten.
This sounds very much like the pruning analogy Christ gave.
It is the ultimate New Testament parallel. The Father prunes fruitful branches so they will be more fruitful still. And notice the emphasis. Pruning is not punishment for failure. It is training for maximum future production. It is the deliberate, skillful removal of what hinders the greatest possible yield.
So if we are tempted to read God's care as harshness, as a lack of love, where does Isaiah ultimately invite us to refocus our attention?
He invites us to breathe deeply, to slow down, and to remember the source of this magnificent wisdom. The essay concludes by pointing us to the ultimate source, the Lord whose compassion never fails and whose mercies are new every morning. We are in the hands of a God who is wiser than any earthly farmer, more intentional than any agronomist, and more compassionate than any human parent. We can trust the measured hand because it is guided by boundless love.
This deep dive into Isaiah 28 has shown us that the most complex truths about God's providence can be found in the simplest scenes of everyday life. So let's recap the farmer's logic that anchors our enduring trust.
Plowing has an end. Sowing has a profound logic to its variety and custom care. And threshing has a specific necessary limit. Every stage, from the messy beginning to the fruitful conclusion, is anchored in God's steadfast love, a love that endures forever.
And the relevance for you, the listener, is this. Your hope rests not in your anxious, limited reading of the current season you may be enduring, but in his magnificent, steadfast care over the whole field of your life. He sees the initial preparation, the specific sowing, and the guaranteed peaceful end.
And that magnificent wisdom covers the entire sweep of his redemptive plan. For Israel, this means God's work of discipline will certainly give way to the bright day of promised, irrevocable restoration.
And for the church.
For the church, it means that the Father's training is relentlessly aimed at holiness and peace, and the cross of Christ guarantees that absolutely nothing, no pressure, no pain, no affliction, no trial, can ever separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord.
We return now to the final, powerful verse that summarizes this entire deep dive and serves as our unshakable anchor, Isaiah 28, verse 29.
All this also comes from the Lord Almighty, whose plan is wonderful, whose wisdom is magnificent.
That is the final encouragement we leave with you today. Take heart. Even the furrows of sorrow, the deepest, most painful lines in your life, are being strategically prepared to become rows for future joy.
The tears we sow today in difficult seasons will be answered with songs of harvest in the Lord's good time, as Psalm 126 promises. Trust him completely. His wisdom is not guesswork, and his mercy is never late.
May you rest today and in the coming days in the magnificent wisdom of the Lord, trusting his measured hand to bring forth a harvest of righteousness and peace in his good time.